we are going to continue with our investigation into using IMVU's Toolkit to create poses. So last time we created a sitting pose or a seated pose, and when we did that we also added a few reference blocks to represent our furniture item into the scene so that we had some context essentially for the pose. So this creates a bit of an issue because you generally want to be creating your furniture item first and creating your pose to fit the furniture item. But it can be done the other way around. So as we created the pose and we dropped in our reference objects, how do we then use this scene, this data, to create a furniture item from these objects? So we want to use these, but we want to do it in a way where we are not then upsetting the pose that we created. So we want to keep this where it is, but we also want to use these objects as our furniture item. So what we can do with this is, first we need to just check that we are in object mode. We are object mode for everything, because what we want to do is drop in a reference that acts as a point relative to where the avatar is positioned, because this will be our seat node. So to do that, we just go to the add menu and drop in an empty. So add empty and then use a cube. Drop that in place, and that's positioned itself at the 3D cursor, which is exactly where we need it to be, at grid 0 or 0, 0, 0, so that's the XYZ 0, which is the origin or root of the avatar. So this is going to correspond to the seat node that we'll use. So once we've got that in place, what we can do is open up the outliner. Where is our object? It should be selected, so press the numpad 0, there it is, empty. We don't want to export this because that's not what we're doing here, so we can move that, click drag and drop that in the main collection. Let's just minimize these. So it's sitting in scene collection. So we're just going to double click and rename this. So this is going to be our seat ref underscore ref. And then we've got our mesh objects. These are the seat and the two books. So if we select the seat, go into our custom layout, we'll call this seat.mesh, and these will be our books. So book.mesh. This is just so that we have a clear identifier, book2.mesh, as to what the objects are. Let's double click, rename that book1, seat.mesh. So we've got our name there. Let's just move that out of the way for a second. So we've got our name, seat.mesh, book1.mesh, book2.mesh. So we're going to save this. File, save as, number 4, save as. Now what we need to do, we rename that one, let's just double check. Yeah, seat ref. So what we're going to do, we're going to create a new scene. So from the file menu we just want new, and then it'll be general. Don't save. We've got to create our new duplicate, double click, TikTok outliner, double click, TikTok 3D. So now we can join areas. So that's our 3D TikTok outliner. That way, that way. So what we're going to do here, go back to 3D view, sidebar, we want the toolkit, and we're just going to add a furniture tool. Create furniture. So these are all the options for the tool, the furniture tool. And we have dummies that represent the avatars in their sitting or seated and standing pose, and a reference object that is the height of a seat. So we don't actually need these. What we need is the root node. This. So what we're going to do here is append. So file, append. We're going to drop in those objects that we created. Append, browse to, this might not fit on screen. Browse to the file. Number 4, there it is, double click. We want object, double click, and in here we want book1.mesh, book2.mesh, and our seat. So there's our seat ref, and we also need the seat mesh. So we've got the seat node and the meshes. So we are appending those into the scene. So all we need to do is just click on append. You don't need to mess around with this. This is fine. And it'll bring in our objects. And what we should have, so if we close the toolkit, so N, go into our custom outliner. So there are our objects. Let's just hide the root for the moment. We want to hide the reference object. So this just allows us to see all of our custom objects. So there are our custom objects. And it's done something that may not always happen. It's positioned our selection of objects into the scene relative to where the root node is, or the root node of the furniture nodes. So let's just hide that as well. So that's that one and that one. Let's see if that's hidden them. Yep, seat ref. There we go. So we've got our objects in as a furniture item. So what we need to do is use this, our seat ref, as the position for our seat node. But what we need to do first is position the furniture item, so that's the meshes, and this as a group relative to the origin point, which is where the furniture root node will be. So what we can do here is we'll use this object as our parent object. So this is the master object of this collection of 4 objects. So what we'll do is select, shift click all the other objects, then the parent object last, and then object, parent, object. So object parent is underneath this flyover, and then we'll get this little pop-up in the corner. We want to make sure that object is set as a type and keep transform is active. So that will now mean that if we select the parent object, the stool, press the G key, the whole lot moves as a set. And this avoids problems where we inadvertently move something that we shouldn't do, because we need to keep all of these in the same positions or locations that they are in relative to each other. So once we've got that, we can literally just move that out of the way. This is just so that we can unhide the furniture export components. So let's unhide the root. Go back to our 3D view. So we now have the root. So what we want to do is position the seat relative to the root. So select our mesh, and again it's moving as a group, and we just position that relative to the root node, because as with all furniture items, the root determines where the furniture item is positioned in a room because it latches on to the furniture nodes. So now that we've got that, we've also now got the new position of the seat node, or the reference for the seat node. So all we need to do now that we've got all of this set up, so Toolkit is drop in a seat node set. So we've got 4. We've got idle, which overrides standing and sitting. We've got standing and we've got sitting. We've also got custom, which is what we need because we're going to add a custom seat node set. So all we need to do is just rename this. So let's just call it custom spot. So that'll be our name. All we do is just click on the custom button. It'll add in a set, which we can just move to one side, hold control to snap to the grid. And then all we need to do is move this set using the custom seat spot as our control. We just move that to the location of our seat reference. And the easiest way to do that is literally select the seat node, the actual seat node, shift click our seat reference. Let's just hide the toolkit so that we've got more screen space. And then we can use snap selection to active. So this is our selection and this one is our active object. So what this should do is move this collection of seat nodes into position relative to our seat reference. We don't need to select all of them, we just need to select the seat node. So shift click our reference and then object, snap, selection to active. And there it moves into position. That's all we need to do. So let's check our setup. So there's our seat mesh. There are our meshes. There's our seat reference. There's our root node, avatar nodes, and this is where the seat nodes will be. So we've got seat 01 dot and our custom label, in this case custom spot. We've got catcher, pitcher, again custom spot, the append, handle. Those are always just appended a number. So seat 01, 01, 01, 01, which confirms that it's a set. So our reference is now redundant because we've now got our seat node in the correct position. So we can hide that. And notwithstanding the fact that these are, actually let's just apply some materials to this. We don't necessarily need to do any UV mapping in this particular exercise because what we can do is just apply a material. So we'll use the outliner to do all of this. So we've got our seat mesh selected. Everything's parented to that, remember? So the book, the reference, they're all parented to that as a group. So select our seat and we'll just add a material. So we'll use the default. We'll call this stool space. So this is our IMVU compatible material name, square brackets, 0, close square brackets. That's our preview. Let's give it a color. Let's go with green. So if we go into the 3D view, our object is now green. So if we wanted, we could assign different materials to our objects or our other objects, because that would then allow us to create custom or separate images. We'd be able to map separate images to the stool and to each book. So this allows us to add a material and a texture to each object if we wanted to, or we could use the same one. But as we've got these, let's just give each one a separate material. So let's call this, right, so we've got stool 0, that's our first material, so we need to create a new one. So click on new. So we'll call this book 1, or because we're using IMVU compatible material names, we can do book. We can use the same label, space, and our unique identifier is the number that we would otherwise need to assign for IMVU compatible material names. So that's book space 1. Let's give this a different color. Same again, select our object, new. We can do the same again, book, same label, space 2. Give this a different color. So now we have 3 objects, 3 materials, which will allow us eventually to put 3 different textures on here. Right, so let's just save this before we go any further. File, save as. Go all the way down to the bottom where the rest of the project files are. And we want TikTok sitting, so this is number 5. Save. So for furniture items, that's pretty much it. This is just a standard furniture item with a simple seat node set. And in this case, it's a custom seat node set. So we've got our catcher and pitcher, our handle, and the seat node. So for exporting, and that's all we need to do, so we can export this now. So for that, we need to double check in the outliner. We need to double check where our objects are in relation to the furniture export folder. Everything that we want to include with our furniture when we export it must reside in the furniture export folder. So as we grouped all of these together, first thing we might want to do is ungroup them. So select all our mesh objects. We haven't got the seat node shown, so let's go into, let's hide these for the moment. Turn on seat ref. Back in the 3D view, select object, parent, format, so parent's underneath here, and we want clear and keep transform. So we're clearing the relationship between all the objects so that they end up being just individual objects that can be moved individually. So object, parent, clear and keep transform. So we'll get this pop up again at the bottom. Everything there is okay. So now we should be able to, if we double check, we can click on each of the objects and move them independently. That's what we need. So back into the outliner, turn on our furniture export folder, hide the seat ref, and then all we need to do, why has that got an animation associated with it? Let's just double check that. Dope sheet, action. Right, yes it has. So we need to make sure that there isn't one. So just click the X. We don't want any animation associated with any of these. And it's probably brought those in by default because we brought the files in from a pose project. This is one of the reasons why you don't do furniture item backwards like we were doing. So generally speaking, as mentioned, you don't want to create your pose and then create your furniture item around the pose, because that can include incidental data in the mesh. So if you miss that, so that's now gone. That's okay. In terms of when you are setting everything up and you leave animation data in place, when you export that and get it into IMVU, it can cause odd problems, because what that likely does is that the animation data is relative to the object, because the FBX file format, you can animate objects without needing to use a skeleton, because it treats the object itself as a bone within a skeleton or armature, or as an armature itself. So what that likely would have done is when we bring this into IMVU, it'll reset the position of the meshes relative to where they were in the pose project. Because remember, the pose file or the avatar is pose relative to this point. So now that we've got these objects where they should be for a furniture item, for the animation data that may be latched onto these objects, it's going to reset it to where it was when we created the pose. So be careful of that if you do create furniture item backwards. So if you are creating your pose and then your furniture items built around the pose, you want to avoid doing that. Right, so outliner, we want to move, so shift click, we want to move these into furniture export. And if we really want to double check, what we can do is with our meshes selected, so shift click, we can then shift click the root node. So that's the furniture root node. Let's just move that down a little bit. That's the furniture root node. Object, parent, object. We don't necessarily need to do this because the exporter should do it automatically for us, so long as our objects are inside furniture export. Because the toolkit recognizes the root node and it recognizes the fact that we've got meshes in here, and it will link them all up correctly relative to the root node, which is the master object in the furniture file. So, and we can double check this by clicking or selecting the root node and moving that, and it will move the whole lot, including the catcher and pitcher and our meshes. So that's the prep step. So let's just save this. File, save as, number 6. So now to export, all we need to do is the toolkit, so the N key. So we used custom seat node, we gave it a custom label that excludes the word seat to avoid causing problems, and that's all we need. So scroll down, we're going to use the export button. We do not use, if we're using the toolkit, we do not use the FBX exporter that comes with Blender, so we don't use this at all. That causes problems. So export. That will do its thing. Usually there is a confirmation message, but because we're in this format, this portrait format, it's not going to show on screen. So that's exported our files. All we need to do now is import this into Studio. So this is going to be a little tricky because we can't smush this down too small. So create a new project. We want rooms and furniture, furniture, empty furniture. So click on that, and in the preview it won't show anything. And all we do is derive. So there's our avatar based on our inventory. So we need to bring in two FBX files here. We need to bring in the pose and the furniture item. So you don't necessarily need to bring them in any particular order, but when you bring in a pose into a furniture project, the avatar skeleton is often included with the import, and that will override the furniture skeleton, which can confuse things and often means that you then have to reset the skeleton to make sure it's using the right one. So let's just import our pose first, which is pose TikTok sitting. So select, open, so that's what it's found. Set up FBX. We don't need to do anything here for the pose, so we're just next. No materials, obviously. So there is our animation. Review. And see, for furniture, that's the skeleton. So we've got to keep an eye on what that does. So import. So it's going to bring it in. It won't do anything necessarily. So it's brought in our assets. So now we need to bring in the furniture file. So import FBX. Where did we save that? Same place, but that was prepended furniture. There it is. So the tool, when you export a project using any one of the tools, it'll prepend what the tool is in front of the name of whatever you called the file. So in this case it's fern for furniture. Poses, it'll be poses. Clothing is, I think it's clothing. Attachments is attach, and so on. So let's select that, open. So now it's found these bits, 3 materials, 3 meshes, 1 skeleton. So set up FBX. So here we want to set up our objects and set the mesh ID. So the seat is our primary mesh, so we want to set that at 0. And then the other one, so book 1, that can be mesh 1 or mesh ID 1, and the other one is number 2. Ignore the label that's associated with the mesh ID. These are generic and associated with the avatar. They don't change depending on the item that we are deriving from or importing. So we just want to pay attention to the numbers. So everything else here is okay. So next. Even though we did not UV unwrap or map our objects, all we did was assigned a material. Because each material has a color, IMVU has converted that color into a simple image, 1 pixel by 1 pixel. And that's all we need. It'll just assign that to our objects and apply it to the whole thing. So we've got our green, orange, and blue. So next. No animation, thankfully, so it hasn't brought in any of those animations that were associated with the mesh, so that's good. So review. So that's what it's going to bring in, our meshes, the materials, the colors, and the skeleton. So import. So there it is, auto-assembled for us. So there it is. Which handle? So that looks like the handle for our... Let's turn on the skeleton. Yeah, so it's that one. That skeleton, viewing the skeleton, does allow us to see that our skeleton has been brought in correctly. Right, so that's our assets. That's our seat component. We need to create an action. Click on the action button, new action, and we need to rename this or edit this and rename this stance dot custom pose. That's the label we attributed to the seat node in Blender. Action type, we don't need to change that for furniture items. So ensembles, there's our ensemble panel, and we should have in the assets our pose. There it is. So this is a static seat pose, so one frame, so start frame 1, end frame 2. Want this to loop forever. Everything else is okay. We can disable gaze or enable disable gaze. Apply, preview, and then we should, if we click on our seat node, we should see the pose on our furniture item. Now if we don't see the pose, we need to go back into Blender and double check the name that's associated with the seat node. Oh, custom spot, that's why. So our label name trigger has to be exactly the same as our label assigned in Blender. So it is case sensitive and it needs to start with an uppercase letter. So make sure you get that right. So custom spot. Let's just move him off spot for the moment. Somewhere else. There we go, move him there. Right, so preview. So now we have our custom pose. Voila. Let's make this a little wider. So that is our custom sitting pose, which we created first. We then dropped in some reference objects relative to our pose. We've converted those objects into a seat, well, a furniture item with a custom seat that accommodates the pose that we created. So that is creating. So we can ignore these dummies. They're just there for reference. We can still keep them in the scene, they don't do anything, and they're not exported with our file. But we've imported or appended our mesh objects from our pose file and then converted this essentially into a furniture item with the proper placement. So that's the one thing we need to keep an eye on. So what this has done is we've got our root node that's latched onto the furniture node that's in this room, in this scene. So that means whenever we move the object, it'll latch on to those nodes, and the pose is posed relative to the furniture item. So of course, the next thing is just to go into the info panel, drop in all our information. So if we click on photo, What's it going to do for our furniture item? Not great, but usable. So let's select that one. Select. It'll use that for both of them. So that's our thumbnail. Ideally, you'd be adding your own. So what we can do is, if we wanted to do that, replace photo, and we'll use our generic reference icon. There it is. So open. So it'll use that instead. Select. So it's now using our manual thumbnail for the classic client and this one for desktop mobile. So if we call this, let's just call it a bookstall. General audience, furniture, profit, let's just say 100. Derivable, yes. Searchable, allow inclusion of third parties. So we're going to upload this. So we'll save and then submit. But you generally, there's our credit information, that's the costs. You generally don't want to do this because our object doesn't have a UV map. So if someone were to derive from this stool or this project, all they would be doing is changing the color that's associated with the meshes. It's not necessarily ideal in terms of creating a sellable project or product. So that's now submitted, okay, and that's it done. So that's in two parts. Let's just save this again, save as. In two parts we created, that's number 7. So we created our, was it number 3? Yeah. So we created the pose first. We dropped in our furniture reference objects to give the pose some context, and we positioned those relative to the pose. We've then given these some names so that we know which ones they are. We dropped in a seat node reference which is relative to the pose itself, because that's the origin point of the pose, and that needs to latch on to the seat node, not the furniture. So once we've got that set up, we've then, number 7, don't save, we've appended, so we've imported that information, set up the meshes correctly relative to it being a furniture item, root node, dropped in our custom seat nodes, set up or configured our furniture export selection or collection, made sure that these are all in the right place, so under furniture export, and then just exported using the export option in the toolkit. And of course that's given us 2 FBX files, so we have an FBX file for the pose, an FBX file for the furniture item. Both are then brought into Studio separately. So it brings in, well, you want to bring in your pose first, then your furniture item, because in component we would then need to reset the skeleton, because the incoming avatar skeleton will override. So we can see furniture is root node underscore root.xsf, but because we brought in a pose, we've also got root node anim avatar master root, but that's the avatar skeleton. If we brought this in after bringing in the furniture item, we'd be looking at the avatar skeleton here. not the furniture skeleton. So we then need to change the asset to make sure that it is root node underscore root.xsf. If you want to create furniture items with custom poses, this is how you do it. You've got to create your furniture item as a separate furniture item project, and then use that as your reference for your pose. But again, you can do it the other way around, but it's best to do it the air quotes proper way, which is your furniture item, set it up for your custom pose, and then pose your avatar relative to the furniture item in a pose project.